Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric. As we barrel our way through fall, I can't help but think of 1888's Autumn of Terror whenever September arrives. Maybe that's just a side effect of hosting the show for so many years that it comes to mind almost automatically. What you're about to hear isn't directly about the Jack the Ripper murders, but it's definitely Jack the Ripper adjacent. If you're a longtime listener, you have heard us touch on the Thames Torso Murders before, but this episode is an entire interview devoted specifically to that series of crimes. And my guest has a suspect she presents to us, which makes this interview especially interesting. Hope you enjoy this. Off we go. Well, I have a returning guest to the show today who I am very excited to talk to, Sarah Bax Horton. She is a former civil servant for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. She was first on Most Notorious in November of 2023 to talk about her book, One-Armed Jack, Uncovering the Real Jack the Ripper. In that book, she named Hyam Hyams as the man she believes committed the murders of the canonical five during the infamous Autumn of Terror. Her most recent book is called Arm of Eve, Investigating the Thames Torso Killer, which, of course, is the subject of today's interview. Welcome back to the show. So great to have you here again.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's good to be back.
Yes. So the Thames Torso Murders are often seen as part of the wider Jack the Ripper landscape. What sparked your deep dive into this series of murders? Was it a natural extension of your research from your first book, or did something else draw you in?
When I was researching my first book, there are 11 unexplained deaths on the Metropolitan Police Whitechapel Murders files. And because I wanted to explore the Jack the Ripper case thoroughly, and I wanted to have an understanding of the knowledge and methods of the police of the day, because my great-great-grandfather, Harry Garrett, was a police sergeant who had worked on that investigation. So I looked across the whole 11 cases, and it became apparent to me that Scotland Yard had divided them into two separate serial killer series, and then there were a handful of additional cases, not by the same hands, but by other random unidentified perpetrators. So I wrote my book, One-Armed Jack, about Jack the Ripper, and I covered 6 murders which I felt Jack the Ripper had carried out between August and November 1888. And I then had all of my research material for the rest of the file, and I noted that Scotland Yard identified a second series, and this is the Thames Torso series, which is 4 murders overlapping the time frame of Jack the Ripper between 1887 and 1889.
So we've talked about the victims murdered by the Thames Torso Killer on this show in the past, but it's been a while. If you don't mind, can you walk us through this series of murders? When and where the bodies were discovered, what we know or don't know about the victims based on their remains?
You've already asked quite a challenging question, because
Sure.
this is an extremely intangible, intransigent case, and I will explain why. It does deal with the murders of 4 women, presumably in central London. But what happened was that their dismembered remains were deposited in the tidal River Thames and in canals and at inland sites. And so it caused considerable debate about where the murder locations were, where the women were from, and where exactly, in the case of the tidal river, where the killer actually deposited those body parts, because they can be swept for miles up and down river as the tide goes in and out. And so what we have are 4 cases which are named after places where body parts were found, but they are not the murder locations. And of the 3 women, only 1 was ever identified. And I'm not going to go into gruesome detail, but none of the women's heads were ever recovered. And therefore, it was quite an identification challenge for the police and for the forensic experts of the day, who were called police surgeons.
Absolutely, yeah. So these murders are often lumped together with the Whitechapel murders. But these torso murders, each one has its own identifying name, as you said, based on the location of the body. And the first is known as the Rainham case, correct?
Yes, we start off in May 1887 in Rainham in Essex, which is about 16 miles east of central London, but way beyond the East End and not in Ripper territory. And what happened was that a river worker called Edward Hughes found a bundle on the Thames foreshore which contained part of a woman's torso. He reported this to the police, and they were instantly confronted with the conundrum of who the woman was, where she was murdered, even the cause of death, the date of the murder, and so on. And multiple body parts emerged along the River Thames, meaning that the name of Rainham in Essex, attributed to this case, is almost a misnomer or red herring, because, as I say, a body part was simply washed up there by the River Thames. And the police surgeons of the day worked very hard with the police to try to ascertain an identification not only of the killer, but of each woman. And they were able to say that the victim was an adult female with dark hair, between the ages of around 25 to 35, about 5'3" tall, who had not had a child. And there was the use of canvas and knotted cord to bundle up part of the remains. And the police were very much at a loss. And at this point, and indeed for the following case, they had no suspects and they were unable to identify the victims.
Right. So the second in the series, the body is discovered in October of 1888, and it's notable because it happened in the middle of the Autumn of Terror, and many ripperologists, because of the timing of this killing, will include it as part of the Jack the Ripper murders. Wouldn't you agree?
I completely agree. So we're at the height of the Jack the Ripper scare in the autumn of 1888, which has been called the Autumn of Terror. And we have the Whitehall mystery. I should mention, and I'm sure that your listeners will be very well aware, that Whitehall is the seat of the British government. And in fact, body parts were found in the foundations of New Scotland Yard as it was being constructed at the behest of the Metropolitan Police. So you can imagine, was this an audacious act on behalf of the killer? Or was it a convenient riverside location to hide body parts in the rubble of a building site? What we know about the victim was that she was better dressed and probably of a higher social status than the other victims. She had fashionable clothing on, which we know because it was used to wrap up her body parts. She was very tall, 5'9", well built and statuesque, with dark brown hair, and again aged 25 upwards. Not only was she bundled in clothing which had some potential to be identified, as she might have been herself from her striking figure and physique, but a piece of the Echo newspaper dated 24th of August 1888 was also wrapped with the parts. And so it gives us a possible date or a suggestion of an approximate timing anyway, when the killer wrapped up the body parts for disposal. Now, the police worked extremely hard on this case, and they did identify the manufacturer of the fabric of her quite distinctive black patterned skirt. However, they were unable to trace the skirt's owner, and it may indeed have been second-hand clothing that was passed down. And so we have 2 murders in a series, and no suspects and no identification of the victims, which might help because the victims may often know their killer, and certainly in terms of geographical location, it would have been useful to know where they were from and what their usual movements were.
The Whitehall mystery attracted far more attention than the Rainham case, largely because of its timing. It happened right in the middle of the widespread panic sparked by Jack the Ripper.
The Thames Torso Murders started to be labelled and numbered in the Ripper series, and the press used it to fuel more sensationalism, which sold more copies. And so this is where the Thames Torso case is less well known, because it's been subsumed into the Ripper case quite wrongly. And also, it doesn't seem to have any identifying features because of the challenges of these types of murder.
Right. So the third victim is Elizabeth Jackson. And of course, this case is notable because her body was identified, and it was discovered in the early summer of 1889.
The police had some good fortune with the Battersea murder, because although the woman was initially unidentified, she was on her home territory, and the body parts were discarded in the river between Battersea and Chelsea. And the young woman who was killed was actually from Chelsea. She was a Chelsea prostitute, and she frequented Battersea, which was just over Albert Bridge on the other side of the river. And so on this occasion, the body parts were deposited in the river. The tidal movement was not sufficient to carry them away. And so the investigation centred over Chelsea and Battersea in a way that it might not have if the body parts had gone downstream, as others had, further east into Southwark, Lambeth, and even Essex, as we know. And the victim was Elizabeth Jackson, aged 24, of medium height, and very sadly, she was heavily pregnant. She had very distinctive strawberry blonde hair, and she had a scar on her wrist and on her arm, which made her more identifiable. And her body parts were bundled in recognisable second-hand clothing, and the clothing description was picked up by the neighbour who had given her those clothes. And this is how the case, or the name Elizabeth Jackson, was raised with the police, and they were quickly able to identify Elizabeth Jackson and to have a much better understanding then of her movements between Chelsea and Battersea and her lifestyle.
That was some crack police work, right?
They were assisted by the fact that both of Elizabeth Jackson's parents were long-term inmates at Chelsea Workhouse, and they sadly were able to access the newspapers in which the report of the unidentified women was reported, including a very full list of her clothing and some indication of her appearance. And the fact that she was heavily pregnant as well would have made her sort of a more noticeable figure. And in this case, knowing that Elizabeth Jackson was the victim, the police quickly discovered that she had an abusive, violent former partner called John Faircloth, who by coincidence was known as Jack. And they put out wanted posters for John Faircloth. And they were very enterprising in this instance because Faircloth was an itinerant millstone dresser. He travelled all over the country on foot, sharpening millstones for commercial use. And he had travelled from London when he split up with Elizabeth over a month before her murder. He travelled to Devon, which is in the west of England and a few hundred miles away. A local policeman spotted him and arrested him and got Scotland Yard to actually come and pick him up and take him back to London for possible court proceedings. Possibly disappointingly, and certainly for me, a slight disappointment, Faircloth was discovered by Scotland Yard to have been out of London for a full 10 days, both before and after the murder of Elizabeth Jackson. And we know that she was murdered on the night of the 3rd of June, 1889, because she was seen by friends that afternoon, and her body parts were discovered early on the 4th of June, as I say, not having been washed away by the tide.
I mean, this is so much more challenging, more difficult, investigating these murders, the Thames Torso murders, because there's just so much less to go on than in the Whitechapel murders.
It's an incredibly difficult case for the reasons I've mentioned. And of course, I'm only giving you an overview. There's much more detail in my book. But the police had nothing to go on. And another aspect to mention is that there were many witnesses in the Jack the Ripper cases, because eyewitnesses saw a man either accost the victim sometimes minutes before her murder, or behaving oddly afterwards. And so we do have this composite picture of Jack the Ripper as a 35-year-old East Ender with dark hair, stout, 5'7.5" tall, and so on. And so when profiling and looking for suspects, they really need to hit these certain criteria. Whereas for the Thames Torso case, we have no suspects apart from John Faircloth, who was not prosecuted. And we don't have any witnesses, and it's all about not having the knowledge of the murder location and the dismemberment locations if they were different, or where the killer necessarily put the body parts into the river or at the inland locations. We just don't really have very much to go on. And I admit that when I first started researching this case with the intention to write a book, I wasn't sure that I was going to have my own prime suspect. However, as you know, I do.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to ask you about him. But I'd like to go back to the fourth and final murder of this series. It's known as the Pinchin Street Torso case. And that happened in September of 1889, which put the duration of these murders from beginning to end over about 27 months, I think.
That's correct. So the discovery of the Pinchin Street torso actually took place 136 years ago, today, as in the date of recording, which we didn't plan,
Oh,
but
wow. Oh, my
it is
gosh.
quite a coincidence.
Well, everyone knows we're recording this on September 10th now.
And the torso, which was a woman's sort of body, but with the arms attached, was discovered inside a railway arch in Whitechapel. And we have the most extraordinary coincidence of it being in prime Ripper territory. So it's close to the murder Ripper location of Elizabeth Stride at Berners Street, close to Ripper headquarters at Lemon Street Police Station, where my police ancestor was stationed. And like Whitehall, this is an inland deposit, meaning that it must have been carried or transported by land. Whereas for the riverine deposits, I considered that they were dropped from a boat. And again, the victim was aged around 35, a short and busty brunette. The police surgeons believed her to be a prostitute, and she was only wearing a chemise or vest that was torn and bloodied and had been badly handmade. And so the police again, I think they did find the manufacturers of the fabric, but they had no leads. And again, they were unable to identify the victim, let alone any suspect as her killer.
The Thames River is really its own character in these horrific events. It's an accomplice to the killer. The killer effectively uses the Thames River to cover up his crimes.
I felt strongly that this was a river murder, and you'll find that even in the inland deposits, it's very close to a dock, a canal, or indeed the Thames itself. So when I was profiling the Torso Killer, I thought that he was mobile on the water and dependent on the tides. And you can see that where he deposits big body parts on land, he's both run out of time to conduct further dismemberment and the tides are wrong. so he can't dispose of it in the river. And as I say, very date-bound and time-bound, which implied a working person. I thought he was based south of the River Thames because most of his criminal activity was on the north, and I thought that would be a distraction. And I was looking in the records for somebody with a criminal record as a sex attacker or of charged with domestic violence, perhaps. And there was something about his methodical yet inexpert disposal of his victims' bodies with a knife and a saw. And the forensic experts of the day said it was semi-amateurish, maybe a butcher or a hunter, but not anyone with medical knowledge, although it might be someone with some anatomical knowledge. And there was also something about an expert wrapping of the bundles, yet with ad hoc materials, just with the women's clothing, their bootlaces, pieces of canvas and cord, things that would be lying around on deck or just available or to hand, but not proper professional, fresh wrappings, if you see what I mean. And I felt very strongly that this was a waterman, which was a river worker who carried passengers in a rowing boat across the River Thames, or a lighterman, who was somebody who carried goods in barges. And that's who I started to look for.
So research-wise, where do you start looking when you have 3 unidentified victims?
At the start, I use an online newspaper archive that is fairly comprehensive. And it's because a lot of the criminal cases of the day were reported almost verbatim. So the court reporters would actually take down the wording of the witnesses, the defendant, the judge, and so on. And these were fully reported in the newspapers. I found them immensely helpful in the Ripper case, where in some instances the official inquest papers have been lost or destroyed. So, particularly with sex crimes, again, they were reported in the newspapers, but they were sometimes sanitized for the Victorian sensibility. But they were well reported. And I started looking for someone, a waterman or lighterman, who had been violent. I was looking for crimes of violence, including domestic violence, because we know that serial killers often are abusive and violent to their partners. And I found my prime suspect, waterman and lighterman James Crick. And what I discovered was that his wife charged him with a violent assault on her because it was the end of their first year of marriage. He'd been depriving her of food and money, and she was living in very miserable conditions. She had a baby, and he would either stay out all night or come home late, possibly drunk, and kick her. And where she was doing needlework to try to make some money, he would kick the work and destroy it. And so he'd beaten her up, and she went to court. It was reported, and by coincidence, this was at the same time as the Rainham murder, the first in the series. And unfortunately, the prosecution wasn't pursued because James Crick made a counterclaim against his wife, and I believe he prevented her from appearing for the following hearing. So the case was simply dropped. But what was interesting about James Crick was that he was twice charged with rape and attempted murder. And those two cases illuminate and answer many of the puzzling issues about the Thames Torso murders. And this is why he really is my prime suspect.
What do you believe was this guy's initial trigger? Was there an event maybe that set him off in committing these murders?
It's clear from the records that he was a prolific rapist. So when he was finally convicted, which I'd like to talk about later, the police reported how many complaints there had been against him by women, including complaints of rape, which were very difficult to substantiate in those days. And unfortunately, convictions were very difficult to secure. And this is the sad fact which actually continues into the modern day.
Oh, very sadly true, yes. There were other suspects on your radar as well, correct? Was there anyone besides James Crick that was intriguing to you?
I looked at not the Ripper suspects, but I looked at the type of person who was considered to have trades that would lend themselves well to concealing body parts or blood on one's garments. So, we always look at butchers, slaughtermen. There's also the cattlemen who would come in with cattle to be slaughtered. They'd come into the docks on boats, and the cattle would go to market, be slaughtered, and so on. I looked at John Faircloth's brother actually lived in London at the time. I had a good look at him. I thought, well, if it's not him, could it be his brother? I mean, there's really a sort of long list of suspects or types that I do include briefly in my book, but that I felt there was just nothing to connect them. Whereas with James Crick, with these rapes and attempted murders, he even threatened to put the women in the River Thames, as he did the other women who had been found before. That I was starting to get some real momentum in my investigation.
So your belief is that he basically lured these women onto his boat, right?
Yes. So James Crick was actually prosecuted and for these two crimes, and he was convicted for the second. And they do illuminate what happened in the Thames Torso cases. So the first case is of rape and attempted murder against a woman in her 30s called Jessie Miller. And improbably, it was the day when the Shah of Persia arrived in London to meet Queen Victoria. As you can imagine, he came up the Thames on the royal yacht. It was a spectacle. And watermen like James Crick had their boat out for paying passengers. As he was in the Westminster area, he hailed Jessie Miller, who was walking along the embankment, and he invited her onto his boat for a free ride. And at the end of the day, when he'd let the other passengers off, he took Jessie Miller towards his home area, Bermondsey, took her to a pub. They drank together, and he then took her back on his boat, promising to take her home. And what actually happened was that he violently assaulted her in the bottom of the boat, raped her, terrified her. She screamed and was resisting, and she went overboard. The water was shallow. At that time, it was lowish tide, and she was rescued by people in another boat. And James Crick was arrested some days later. The case went to court, but unfortunately, owing to what might have been perceived as a lack of evidence, James Crick, when defending himself, he did a lot of victim blaming and so on. The case was actually dropped. So we have a case of assault on the river, which is not pursued. And the significance of this is not only that justice was probably not served, but also that James Crick remained at large to do his next attack on a woman. And he was also at liberty for the Pinchin Street torso murder, if he were indeed the killer. So that Jessie Miller turning point could have been a very significant one. What happened to Elizabeth Warburton was a few weeks later, in October 1889, she was walking down the street near London Bridge, and James Crick accosted her. They went for a drink together. He then invited her onto his boat. And again, the same thing happened. He raped her. They were in the middle of the River Thames, very isolated. She couldn't get away. And then what illuminates the Thames Torso cases is that he started to move her around. He took her onto a barge, and then he took her onto a pleasure steamer that had no passengers on it, and it had some guard dogs in the cabin. He locked her in the cabin, set the dogs on her, raped her again, tore her clothes off. It was an extremely violent attack.
That's
And
horrifying.
yes, it was medieval in its brutality. That's what the press wrote about it. She was a strong woman. She got hold of an iron bar or poker, hit him, broke out of the locked cabin, stood on deck and screamed. And the river police were nearby in a boat, and they came and rescued her. And they also detained James Crick, who had got into his rowing boat and was heading in the opposite direction. So on this occasion, this case went to the Central Criminal Court, or Old Bailey, which is the main criminal court here in London. And James Crick's luck ran out, because although he again went for the victim blaming, although he said that Warburton had attacked him because he hadn't any money on him to pay for her services, Crick came before Judge John Day. And this was a judge who was so severe that his nickname was Judgment Day. And needless to say, the jury convicted. Other cases were mentioned of complaints by women against Crick. And the judge said society must be protected from such ruffians. And he gave Crick a 15-year sentence of imprisonment with hard labour. And so this is the end of the Thames Torso murders. They don't restart many years later when Crick is released from prison. And as I say, there's much in the methodology and the facts of the Crick cases which compare well to the Torso cases.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if he indeed was the Thames Torso Killer, Elizabeth Warburton was extremely lucky. If he had killed 4 women already, it's very likely that she would have been his 5th.
I believe that he would have killed Warburton and even possibly Miller, but I think to me his activities indicate that he was a prolific rapist. And at some point in 1887, rape turned to murder. He got gratification from it. He was able to dispose of the bodies effectively, and he was able to continue, and failures in the law allowed him to continue. I'd like to mention that Jessie Miller had severe bruising on her back from being dragged to the bottom of a boat and assaulted. And we also see severe bruising on the back of the Thames Torso. I beg your pardon, the Pinchin Street Torso. And the other real read across is the fact that Warburton was found naked apart from a torn and bloodied chemise. And I believe you've heard me say those words before, because that was what the Pinchin Street torso was dressed in as well. And I have further theories and analysis in my book about Crick's possible butchery skills and so on.
Do you find any mention in your research of Crick as a suspect in these murders at the time he was being investigated for these other crimes?
As far as I can tell, there was certainly no read across between him personally and the Ripper cases. In terms of the Thames Torso cases, there must have been some suspicion, because what James Crick said to Warburton, and it was read out in open court, was, "I intend to settle you." Now, settle is an act of violence, a threat of violence. We can't say firmly whether in this instance it's a threat to kill, but it's a word that has been used in that manner. "I intend to settle you, as I have done other women that have been found in the Thames, if you make a noise. If you keep quiet, you will be perfectly safe." So it's definitely a threat. He wants her to keep quiet. There's coercive control. There is a threat and indeed acts of violence. But is it enough to be a link to the Thames Torso murders?
Right. I know you talked a bit about this already. You said you went into this project not having any idea what you would find or who you would find, suspect-wise. Was your goal to solve the murders or just to write about them? And if you happen to find someone credible, great. If not, oh well, you were going to still finish the book.
This is a great question. What happened was that I wanted to reinvestigate the case. And unlike in my first book, when I early on present my prime suspect, and then I see the crimes to some extent through the lens of him being the perpetrator. And I also do true crime reconstructions for each of the murders in the murder chapter. On this occasion, I thought it would be really interesting to take my readers with me on the journey. So join me on the investigation and follow my thinking and see what I come up with. And I was hoping that that would be interesting enough. And I certainly thought, after my success with my first book, that I would have some interesting analysis and new ways of thinking to put forward. So I go through each of the murders and really look at what evidence and facts the police have, what their thinking might be. And then, having gone through the four murders, I'm left with reflections and my own profile for the man that I'm seeking. Then I looked for him in the newspapers, in the criminal records, and so on. And I found someone. And when I found a river worker who was violent towards women, sexually motivated, twice charged with attempted murder, convicted once of rape, who had a history of domestic violence against his wife. He had his own rowing boat. He was able to use other boats with more secure cabins or below deck space in the case of barges, which would have been more suitable places to kill and even dismember women, store body parts, and from where to start scattering those bundles into the Thames. And I couldn't really find any sort of disadvantage or downside to following him up as my real prime suspect. What I did when I do the true crime reconstructions right at the end of the book in this instance. And I try to do them as perpetrator neutral, but I do take what we've learned from James Crick's method of accosting the women, giving them alcohol, moving them from vessel to vessel, and so on. And so I do put that into the modus operandi of each of those murders. And I believe that I do it credibly.
Really fascinating. You've got these two charges of Crick's that act like bookends. The first appears right at the start of the murder series when his wife brings a case against him, and that kind of lines up with the Rainham mystery. And then later, Elizabeth Warburton's assault coincides with the Pinchin Street murder. The timing is so interesting.
I think it's also very interesting that he was on bail for the Jessie Miller case and then at liberty for the Pinchin Street torso. And there was also a dock strike in which the watermen and lightermen participated, although they had an obligation to man the pickets and go on protest marches and so on. So you find that he's still date bound and time bound within that period. But in my belief, he did carry out the Pinchin Street murder. And he moored up, there was a dock actually extremely near Pinchin Street railway arch. And I believe that he just took a sack around the corner, deposited it, and walked back. But he was fortunate to miss the patrolling police constable on his beat.
So how old was he when he went to prison, and how long was he in for? Do you have any information on what he did or experienced inside?
Well, again, I have to report an element of disappointment that he was released early for good behaviour, which I can only regret. So he was aged 27 when convicted, and he served 9 years of a 15-year sentence, and he was released in the 1890s. And I then looked for further criminal activity by him. And there's another dismemberment case that took place at Salamanca Place in Vauxhall in 1902. So in my book, I devote a whole chapter to this case. And I won't reveal my thinking about that, but it might be just fair to say that, in my opinion, I don't believe it's part of the Torso series, but I do give enough facts and analysis for my readers to make up their own minds, which is what I long for. So I just love to have an intelligent reader who can look at my hypotheses and examine them for themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm just curious, what kind of feedback are you getting for this book? I mean, introducing a new suspect into the world of ripperology, like you did with Hyam Hyams, I'd imagine you probably got some blowback with all the passion that surrounds those murders. But the Thames Torso murders, of course, are not as well known.
Both of my books were very kindly received by the Ripper community. In fact, for my second book, Arm of Eve, I won Ripper Book of the Year 2024, and I have an award, so I'm very proud of that.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, it is a far less well-known case, and for that reason, I think fascinating to explore now with some sort of with hindsight, with a better understanding now of the Ripper case, just to look at a man who was almost his rival. And certainly an incredible coincidence that there were two serial killers active in central London at the same time. And what a conundrum for the Metropolitan Police.
So I'm sure you've gotten this question, but it's one I feel I should ask. Your belief is that there were two separate killers, just coincidentally killing at around the same time. What are the chances that this was a copycat situation? Or a second killer maybe taking advantage of the chaos and the fear caused by the first? What are your thoughts on that?
It's such a tricky question to answer. Certainly, the press and in the minds of the public, the Torso series fitted in as part of the Ripper series by the same hand. Having sort of detached the two series because that's what Scotland Yard said it was, I just think that the modus operandi was so different, and the killer's movements, his sort of trade. I mean, everything was really so different. And in terms of copycat, the Metropolitan Police were very nervous of any of this series being by the Ripper, thus magnifying their Ripper problem. And certainly there was sort of a gash to the abdomen in the Pinchin Street case, which they raised as a possible copycat. And certainly that location in Whitechapel, as I said, was prime Ripper territory. I mean, James Crick would certainly have been aware of Jack the Ripper. Of that, I believe we can have no doubt whatsoever. And I suppose by the reverse, the Ripper must have been aware that many other murders were being tallied up to his score, which he hadn't committed. But I don't believe that the Ripper was in a very sort of healthy mental state, and it may be that such thinking was simply beyond him.
So are you working on a new book? And if so, is it another Victorian era killer?
I would love to write another book about the Whitechapel murders. However, I need a publisher for that one, so I think that's still work in progress. I'm actually writing a book about the great Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton and his endurance expedition, because a relative of mine stowed away on the ship and ended up participating on the whole expedition. And I'm writing that in his honour and in honour of my mother, because this time it's my mother's side of the family and not my father's.
That makes it extra fun, though, right? You're not only researching a new case, which is always exciting, but to have that family connection too.
Thank you so much. It's my total inspiration and motivation. to find events in history that have touched my family and then explore them and try to honour my police ancestor and other family members as I do so.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, it's been great having you here and hearing about your fascinating research. And I encourage listeners to revisit our original interview. It might give them some extra context. The two books almost feel like a set. So where can we point people who want to get your books to learn more about your work?
My books are widely available. I suppose Amazon is a good start, and the podcasts are extremely widely available across many sort of apps and suppliers. So I think an internet search will probably pull up quite a lot.
So do you view these books as a series?
I do have a chapter in my second book, Why Not Jack the Ripper, really seeking to explain and divide the two series and explain not only their similarities, but also quite fundamental differences. And so the Ripper, you can't really write a book about a serial killer in the 1880s in London without referencing and understanding the Ripper case. They can be read separately. I would prefer my readers to read both and obviously keep following me as hopefully I keep writing more books.
Perfect. So you're active on social media, and we can be sure to include those links in the show notes. If people want to follow you, stay updated on your work, they can easily do that. And thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Again, I have been speaking to Sarah Bax Horton. She is the author of Arm of Eve, Investigating the Thames Torso Killer. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe tomorrow.